You've done so much cool stuff. Can you just explain a little bit of who you are and what you do? And then I want to talk dingoes.
Yes, so I'm an assistant professor at Boston College, and the research that I do would best be called comparative psychology, because what I do is I compare dogs to children to see what's similar about children and dogs and what's different, to help us understand about how have dogs come to reflect us through domestication, but what parts of us are still uniquely our own. And then I also compare dogs to dingoes to see how these traits evolved over domestication.
So did it start as research to understand how kids learn, or and then it evolved into the dog thing?
Exactly. So actually, when I was an undergraduate student at the University of Texas at Dallas, what I did was I was involved in a lab there that was looking at how children learn from different people and how do children decide what's the best source of information? What type of people are the best to learn from? And then when I went on to my PhD at Yale, that was my plan. I went in planning to study child development, essentially. But around that same time, there is a new field, canine cognition, which is looking at dogs, that was blowing up. It started about 20 years ago at this point, and it's just really grown exponentially since then. And so then what I realized is, hey, the dogs can actually tell us a lot about the kids, because we can start to pinpoint what are those pieces that are unique to children and what are the pieces that are shared with our best friends. And so it was in grad school that I switched and started looking at dogs and kids. And then in the mix, there was someone who I knew who'd gone to a sanctuary to work with dingoes. So I went with her. And then when I saw the dingoes, I realized, oh my gosh, these are not dogs. These are very different animals. And it's amazing. They're closely related. They last shared a common ancestor 7,000 years ago. That's a blip on the evolutionary radar. Mm-hmm. But even that little blip, so much has happened to dogs since that time. And so I just became, my passion overtook me for that topic. And so I've switched, and I mostly do dogs and dingoes, and also dingoes compared to kids still.
So, and the dingoes, the idea there, because of that pretty recent split, is we always think about learning where dogs came from by studying wolves, but
mm-hmm.
there's this canine population in between our current domestic dogs and the wolves that is the dingoes, and so they're like a really neat window into what happened in the thousands and thousands and thousands of years between wolves and domestic dogs. Is that right?
That's put perfectly. Exactly that. I mean, if you're I'm happy to give you the very quick Cliff Notes version of domestication and what we know about with the dingoes, if you'd like. But
please do that.
Okay, yes, I didn't want to take too much time on it, but it's the thing I'm most excited about. So I should say before I start, all of this is up for debate. We're just doing our best to take fossil records and archaeological dig evidence and things like that. So what we think is about 50,000 years ago, there was an animal that was very wolf-like, hunting in packs around much of Asia. And then fast forward to about 14,000 years ago, we know that by that time, animals had started to be at least tame around humans. The reason we know this is there's a burial site with a child and a dog-like animal at that time. So what we think happened is within that 50,000 to 14,000 window, humans started to live together in camps. And with camps came trash. Now, trash would be very tempting for these wolf-like animals, but it would also be really terrifying to go into the camps of this other species that might want to kill you. So only the tamest animals that were brave enough to go in with humans went into human camps. Then those animals were close together in proximity, and they were more likely to then mate. And then their puppies were more likely to be more tame. So this happened over many thousands of years. So this is where the dingoes come in. That process I just told you about is called self-domestication, because it's this idea humans played no role in breeding. It just happened naturally. Does that make sense, that first part?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like almost parallel evolution between humans and canines, correct?
And a lot of people think of that actually is a window into potentially our own self-domestication. But then what happened is around 7,000 years ago, seafarers took these self-domesticated animals with them from Asia and went down to Australia. Then these animals went back into the wild, and they have not yet gone through what those other animals did. Meanwhile, in Asia, they were being domesticated by artificial selection, which is humans breeding them for all these different purposes, hunting, herding, sporting, you name it, all these different purposes. But the dingoes have not undergone that. They only are self-domesticated, meaning they're tame, but they haven't actually been bred by humans to live with us as our pets. So dingoes show us, when you compare dogs and dingoes, we can start to see what's happened over this part of domestication where humans bred the dogs. Mm-hmm. When we look back at wolves, we're seeing what is an animal that never went through any of this domestication? What do they look like? What's happened? So we can sort of start to break this down into smaller pieces and really see what's happening with a particular trait.
So dingoes are not native to Australia? I mean, I guess it's a weird way to look at it, right? Because
it's tricky. So actually, at that time, Australia, as we know it, was much different as a landmass 7,000 years ago. So it was actually connected to Papua New Guinea. And so it depends on what you mean by the word native, but they didn't come with, say, the same time rabbits and sheep and other animals from Europe came. They came much earlier, and they came before Australia was what you would even think of it as a continent.
Mm-hmm. So there was a domestication aspect to them. They were brought to Australia, and then there was sort of a rewilding that happened with them. And man, that's fascinating.
Yeah, and so that's one thing we always have to keep in mind. So it's not perfect, right? Dingoes also have undergone this recent natural selection pressure of living in an intense climate that is Australia. Mm-hmm. And we do see the effect of that on the dingoes have different coats. There are desert dingoes and there are alpine dingoes, and their coats are very different. But behaviorally, we don't know much yet. We've only recently discovered there are these different groups of dingoes. And behaviorally, we want to know how different are those, but we see them consistently falling between wolves and dogs, no matter what type of dingo. And things like eye contact. I have a study that looks at eye contact. And when you look at wolf eye contact, even if the wolf is owned by a person, wolves don't make eye contact with people of their own volition. Maybe you can get them to make eye contact, but they don't readily make eye contact. When you look at pet dogs, I mean, almost everyone listening to this show has a working dog or might have a pet dog, and they stare at you with those googly, like, baby eyes, like, give me the treat, look how cute I am. The dingoes fall in between that. And so we start to see this thumbprint of a different stage of domestication. And
that research in eye contact, because I read that, I at least read the summary of that, the paper that you put out there. It's a duration thing, it's tied into, we know wolves don't really look to us to help them or look to us when they need help. And then dingoes fall in between, where they'll hold eye contact and use it to some extent, but not to the full extent of domestic dogs, where they'll look at us to communicate and help us, or, help them solve problems. And so they're just this middle ground case study.
Exactly. And when you think about how things change over evolution, you need some amount of variation in a population. So by the time the animal that's the dingo's ancestor comes on the scene and humans say, hey, look, these animals, this one looks at me a lot more. Let me take it and breed it with this other animal that looks at me a lot. And then, hey, look, now I've got a dog that's really looking to me. And you can imagine there's a lot of, in a sporting dog world or in other worlds as well, you want that eye contact. It's crucial for certain types of jobs. And so they can take this existing variation and then push it through breeding.
Mm-hmm. And we have a lot of trainers on here who, have, they look at eye contact different. So, some of them are huge into it. Some of them not really, but, as a baseline thing, when you're developing a really good symbiotic relationship with any kind of working dog, that dog that's willing to look at you and you have their attention, it's so important for asking the right questions of them.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And it's something that training certainly can bring out as well. And so a lot of it is they're already motivated. And so you have an animal that now is very motivated to make eye contact with you. Much easier to train it if that's what you want it to do than if it's not motivated. So definitely a good example there.
In your opinion, when we're talking the evolution of eye contact between us and canines, it has to come from their kind of social, their packs where they're looking at each other and taking cues off of one another. I guess I don't know how to phrase this. It's something that wolves, they're sitting there going, okay, we've looked at each other in our packs for a long time, and they're using it, but they haven't made that jump to the human connection yet. And so I guess what I'm asking is, do you look at this now like dogs view us as the pack? Like they're not differentiating between dog to dog versus dog to human. It's the same kind of communication.
It's a great analogy. And eye contact is only one behavior. When you look at other behaviors, you do see this. I don't know that I'd go as far as seeing as part of their pack, but definitely I think they see us as one of their own. They're one of their own group. And so a lot of times, you're right, it doesn't come out of nothing. You have a behavior that wolves will do with each other. And then you look and dogs will do it with humans. And so it's sort of just flipping a little switch to say, hey, you're also, the fancy word we use is conspecific. You're one of my own, kind of treating a human that way. The thing that's interesting about eye contact in particular, though, is with wolves, and actually sometimes with dog to dog, it's seen as an aggressive signal to make eye contact. But what you're saying about them being sensitive to each other's eyes is spot on. Wolves do things like they'll pay attention without making eye contact to where another wolf's looking. And they're likely that the wolf suddenly looks like this, another wolf will follow their gaze. And so with dogs, you see dogs also doing that with people. Mm-hmm. And so I think you're right that they just made the jump to think we're in their group.
Yeah, and I guess it really doesn't matter what they think of us as long as they're exhibiting that behavior. It doesn't really matter if they accept us into the pack or a family or something like that, as long as they're doing it. And
Absolutely.
I've had two experiences out in the wild with coyotes, watching them hunt, where, you know, when we talk about this in the eye contact, we always look at it through our own scope of like, okay, this is my experience with people or my experience with my labs or GSPs or whatever. But I've watched packs of coyotes twice set up deer drives, once out west for mule deer and once closer to home for whitetails. And the coordination to like see it from kind of a 5,000 foot view is incredible. And the amount of communication going on there between canine to canine, it's mind blowing when you get to watch it. And so it's a lot of people will kind of hear you say this about, well, dogs do this with us and they communicate this way with us. And it maybe doesn't hold the impact the same way until you fully understand what they're capable of doing.
There's been some really fascinating work coming out of Vienna in Austria. They have a wolf park there where they have a pack of wolves and a pack of dogs that have been raised exactly the same. And so they're able to tell what's the difference genetically. And when you look at cooperation on a task where there's a tray and there's a piece of meat in the middle, and to get the meat, you have to pull two ropes at the same time. So it's a tray that you pull forward with like two handles. Mm-hmm. If you pull one side, you just pull the rope off the pulleys and it doesn't pull it forward. Does that make sense how it works with two pulleys and two ropes? When you put wolves together, wolves have no problem. They go up and they'll solve it together. When you put dogs together, they don't figure it out. But if you put dogs with humans, they will figure it out. And what they've looked into to see is that they think it's because the way that dogs live now, if they're not living with humans, is actually not in a pack like wolves. They usually live in smaller family groups or they live kind of more in isolation. And so the dogs don't have this ability to have a structure that keeps them from fighting in that sort of situation. So they just avoid it. And so when you talk about coyotes having that amazing like way of getting like the deer, it's really interesting to think about. Whenever you get something with domestication, sometimes you lose something. Mm-hmm. And that's something that's interesting to think about. And part of the reason I am so interested in doing my work and comparing the dogs and the dingoes is to see what has been added, what's been taken away. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's a really great example. Is it's totally the case that wolves cooperate, but the dogs don't cooperate as easily with each other.
So what's really interesting about that is, in the hunting dog world, it's been so common for so long. If you've got like an 8-year-old hunting dog that's trained, seasoned, knows what it's doing, and then you bring a puppy out there, people always thought, okay, this dog's going to teach this puppy. And I've talked to a lot of trainers who are like, that old dog does not care about that puppy. It wants it out of it. It's working with you. And people really cling to that because we've said it for decades now. But that example that you just gave there kind of lends credence to that, going like, hey, these dogs aren't teaching other dogs stuff.
I think that's right. I think there's a question. I think there's a way to split apart teaching and learning. And so I've told you a lot of the research I do is actually looking at learning and teaching, and eye contact's an important part of that. But if you separate teaching and learning, I think you're completely right. I don't think, in my honest gut opinion, just based on all the research, is that I don't think that 8-year-old dog cares about teaching the puppy. But there's a learning side. And I think that the puppy might actually sometimes care about learning from the older dog. So there is some research out there that says a dog that's lower in a hierarchy may be more likely to learn from another dog. So
just through imitation?
Through imitation. The specific study I'm thinking of is they had a gate or a fence that there was only one way to get through and it wasn't obvious immediately. And dogs would watch another dog go through the spot. And if they were the subordinate dog, they would follow the dog, even if they didn't know it. But the more dominant dogs weren't paying attention because they thought they had it all figured out themselves, you know? And so I think that you're right. That 8-year-old dog doesn't care, but maybe the puppy does.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the puppy does. But that's an area I think we need a lot more research. And something I think a lot of people ask, there was a video that was going around a couple of years ago of this, what looked to be an older dog teaching a puppy how to go down the stairs. And everyone always brings up this video example as, but look at that dog. It's going slowly. It's teaching. It's like, well, we need to study it more carefully to really know. So
what do you think was going on there in that video?
I think that the older dog was just watching the person with the camera, was giving them a lot of attention. And they're like, what is the person wanting from me here? And so it could be, have you heard about Clever Hans before? So Clever Hans is that horse that they thought could count, but it turns out they were just able to feel the signal of their handler would get really excited before they got to the number. And I think it's hard because the dogs are so good at reading off us. It really takes carefully controlled experiments to see, to break that, to make sure they're not just reading off of a person's energy.